Early access games have been around for a long time, allowing players to jump straight into an unfinished game to provide quality feedback to the devs, and in return, these players will get to play the game early, receive exclusive items, and usually pick up the game for a cheaper price. Early access games are no stranger to the gaming community, but with how AAA full release games have been going, some might argue that a few of them needed to be put in early access. Battlefront Collection or Anthem? In recent times, these early access games have been on the rise, Steam giving early access titles their own storefront, Xbox putting games that are a part of the game preview program onto Game Pass, but why is this? Why are so many early access games appearing? A large contributing factor could be that the gaming industry is now so much more accessible. You don't need a $10,000 PC and a giant team of people to just start producing a game. In some places around the world, you're able to apply for local grants that can give these small development teams a bit of funding, or even the chance to showcase their game to a wider gaming community at events like PAX, DreamHack, or other smaller local conventions. There are many notable games that went through the early access stages, and some may be household names. Things like Kerbal Space Program, DayZ, The Forest, and even Fortnite. The impact that early access games have had on not only the attitude of players towards early access games in development, but the way that they've been able to support smaller studios without massive publishing budgets behind them is a sight to behold. And these are just a few reasons of why I believe that the gaming industry is being saved by early access. Before we can look into why early access is saving the gaming industry, we need to look at what early access really is and how it's different from a traditional game release or even a beta. A traditional game release is a type of release that most gamers would be used to. A game gets announced, developers work on it until it's finished, and then it finally hits the storefront. This is what most gamers would be used to, and most, if not all, AAA games usually follow this release cycle. Publishers want their developers to release a finished, polished copy of the game before gamers get their hands on it, and that doesn't always happen. Now let's talk about beta and why this shouldn't be confused with early access. While sometimes games in early access use the beta tag, not all betas are considered early access games and don't follow the same development cycle as traditional early access games do. Most gamers enter a beta for a limited time in a open or closed beta, which would allow players to play a small section of the game, if not more, if it was closer to its release. Then the release of the game would usually follow the beta, depending on how well the beta was received by players and how stable the full game actually is. However, there are times where beta is used in place of early access, most notably Star Citizen, which is an in-development game that has been in early access since way back in 2015, and it's still going very strong. Now we're left with early access. Now we've already discussed what early access is, but what is the purpose? It doesn't just provide developers with invaluable feedback from players, it also allows them to show a proof of concept for prospective investors to help get more funding for the game, or for smaller indie studios to avoid selling stakes in the company to boost funding via players buying copies. This will allow the company to start a healthy cash flow into the business and allow them to hone in on the things that are most important to players through feedback and building community trust. Now we've briefly touched on the reasons why a developer might consider launching their game in early access. Let's take more of a deep dive into how this can really advantage the developers in the long run and lead to a more polished final release of their game, even if it doesn't release for years to come. When developers launch an early access game, they're expected to consider the community significantly more than a traditional game release. They're expecting players to trust them that they'll continue to work on and eventually release a fully fledged game. Communities who play early access games are usually much more vocal with their feedback for developers because they expect the devs to listen to this feedback since their game is still in development. This feedback is valuable to devs since even just 100 players can playtest new features and patches in one day faster than a whole dev team could in 1 week, leading to much less bugs and a more enjoyable player experience. Along with this feedback leading to bugs being squashed, it can also lead to a more innovative final release, with new features that the devs may not have even thought of. While playing the game, these players will all could play the game differently to each other, and those other players could even be playing completely differently to how the devs intended for the game to be played. And this is perfect because players may suggest a feature, a new enemy, an item, or similar for the devs to add to the game they wouldn't have even thought of. Developers adding these player requested features to their early access game is significantly more likely than developers adding features to AAA games which have already been released. Even though these AAA studios have more budget and bigger teams, they usually have to go through approvals before an update can begin being worked on, whereas a small team of early access devs usually don't need to jump through corporate hoops and are more restricted by the size of the team or by funding than the latter, which is one of the issues that early access helps to solve. Now that we've talked about advantages of early access, we're going to take a quick look at the disadvantages of early access. Now, these disadvantages can affect both the developers and the consumers, since early access games are so delicate during their production process. First, we have unfinished content or features. Now, obviously, when getting into an early access games, players are to expect a lack in polish or unfinished content, but they still expect the game to be playable. Some early access games can be so poorly optimized and require crazy hardware just to get running at a playable frame rate. They're also more prone to game-breaking bugs since the game hasn't been fully play-tested or completed before an update is pushed out. Then, on the other side, we have the uncertainty from developers and players. Developers are uncertain that the players will like their game, will it be a flop, and without the funding from a big studio or publisher, a failed game could be the end of their studio, which is what we have seen most recently with The Day Before, a game that flopped so badly the studio declared bankruptcy a mere 2 weeks after launch. Now, obviously, this is horrible for both developers who are now out of work and the players who purchased the game expecting it to be continually updated. Now, feedback is something I touched on earlier in the video as an advantage, but you can have too much of a good thing. Obviously, not all players are going to have the same feedback, and some feedback will be completely opposite viewpoints. Some players may love the way the story is going, where others may absolutely hate it. Sometimes the feedback could revolve around completely separate topics, but the devs can't act on all feedback at once, and some gamers can get frustrated that their feedback isn't being taken, despite it seeming like a large portion of the community are requesting the same thing. This can lead to players leaving the game because they feel like their feedback isn't being heard, especially if the devs don't provide a reason on why they're not adding something to the game or why they can't add it to the game. Now, continuing with this theme of community not being heard, sometimes a community simply isn't heard and the developers abandon the game midway through its development. Now, this isn't a super common practice for early access games, as it can cause mass community distrust in developers and hinder any future projects they may release. Now, sometimes games are abandoned by developers for good reason, such as Super Dungeon Run, whose lead developer passed away back in 2015. Or the developers will let the players know that the game is being abandoned. While not the best, it's still good for community morale and trust for the developers to let them know not to expect these future updates. And other times, developers just vanish, never posting a news update or pushing another patch. And when something like that happens, the community's trust is damaged with the developer, and if the head developers leave to create a new company, the internet will find out and their reputation could potentially get even worse. Before we wrap up this video, I'm going to briefly talk about early access games that have succeeded and that are proof that early access development and programs do work and can save the gaming industry in a climate where AAA games are getting cancelled or are launching in poor states and frustrating gamers. These early access games give a breath of fresh air to gamers who are sick of games launching poorly when they're expected to be finished and polished. Subnautica is a prime example of an early access game. It was popular among gamers and content creators, and it was given out on Epic Games as a free game of the month. The developers' communication with the community was unmatched. They inserted community Easter eggs into the game, and when the game left early access, it received rave reviews for its story and gameplay. This was all thanks to community feedback on both the story and the gameplay loop of the game. They were able to craft environments over time and release an incredibly polished game. The funding from the game was even enough to create a sequel to Subnautica, Subnautica Below Zero, which went through the same early access development cycle. Another game that's leaving early access very soon that has also been a shining example of exactly what an early access program is all about is Satisfactory. Satisfactory is by Coffee Stain Studios, you know, the guys who made Goat Simulator. Satisfactory has gone through many changes and is currently on update 8 at the time of writing, with version 1.0 coming out in the next few months. Satisfactory was supported by the devs through Steam community posts, update tweets, devlogs on YouTube, YouTube sneak peeks, update videos, and even more. They went all out and focused on the community's experience for the game. They made sure it was optimized and they were adding features that the players wanted. You can tell that the devs play the game as well because they're aware of how specific features feel, and if they don't feel good, they look more closely at how they can change it. Satisfactory hasn't yet implemented a story, but they've teased it, and at the end of the day, it is a sandbox game, so it won't be a major part of it. But they've left small things in the game that serve absolutely no purpose, but to hint at the story, which gets players thinking of their own theories, which makes them want to come back to the game when an update drops. And this is the perfect cycle for an early access game. So, are early access games saving the gaming industry? I believe they're keeping gamers interested in these new game releases. Early access games give gamers those different kinds of enjoyment in gaming. These small games are ones that they either know about because they like the developer, so they support them, or they've just spotted one randomly on a Steam sale and end up really enjoying it, so they continue to follow it along. AAA games have all the excitement and hype built up to it until it finally releases, and if it doesn't meet the gamer's standards, they're left with that sour taste in their mouth. Whereas for a lot of early access games, the same level of hype and expectation just isn't there. So I genuinely believe that early access games are saving gaming by keeping it fresh and interesting. But let me know what you guys think in the comments.